whatever details the Trump administration may be getting wrong here, I do think that these programs are very often ridiculous, sometimes malicious. And I think that the American reaction to these programs has been justifiable, that there's a basic kind of American rebelliousness against the idea that we should have to sacrifice for strangers.
Rand thought that foreign aid is morally wrong. It's not just impractical or expensive or wasteful, but it is actually morally wrong. And it is true, it's impractical, it doesn't work, it's expensive, but because fundamentally it is immoral.
It's not even that we have a bad foreign policy. It's that we have no meaningful, coherent set of principles that we use to identify who are our allies, who are our enemies. And so it should come as just no surprise that we end up wasting money on distractions that have nothing to do with any strategic objectives from a geopolitical perspective.
The Trump administration plans to make major cuts to the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, because the administration claims that the agency is wasteful and it sends money to what it calls often malicious programs, such as DEI concerts in Ireland and productions of Sesame Street in Iraq. And the administration's stance raises question about the legitimacy of foreign aid as such. So, is any form of foreign aid in the interest of the United States? And are the arguments being made in favor of keeping USAID and other forms of foreign aid good arguments? So those questions and more we will discuss today in this episode of the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Agustina Vergara, and with me is Ben Bayer. So Ben, I want to start by giving some basic facts about this program so our audience can get a little bit of context of what we're talking about here. So the USAID has been on the news a lot lately, so here is the basic facts to know. So USAID is an agency that was established in 1961 by President Kennedy, allegedly to do work on things that are called such as global health, disaster relief, environmental protection, and democratic governance and education. That is how the agency is overall framed, and that's what its purpose allegedly is. And the United States Congress appropriated $40 billion for this agency in fiscal year 2023. And USAID and other forms of foreign aid in general are often seen by people as a tool of soft power to complement military and diplomatic efforts of the United States, and is also seen as an avenue for America to help the rest of the world in need. But now the media is saying that this is a huge change in what we used to do. The Trump administration decided to begin dismantling the agency and to take away funding from it. And in an article that was published in February 3 in the White House website, the White House says, and I quote, "For decades, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has been unaccountable to taxpayers as it funnels massive sums of money to the ridiculous, and in many cases malicious, pet projects of entrenched bureaucrats with next to no oversight." And then the article deems the agency wasteful and abusive. So those are some of the facts surrounding the alleged goals of the agency and what how the Trump administration allegedly is viewing it now.
Yeah, so Agustina, I think the first thing to say about the revelations that have come out about these programs since Trump administration has been looking into them is that, a lot of these programs surely are ridiculous and in many cases malicious. I think there are questions to ask about the legal process, about the legality of the process that's being used to review these programs. Already there have been various rulings against the Trump administration as to whether or not they have the authority to make these cuts versus its Congress's authority. We're going to leave those questions aside for today, because what we want to do is to look at what does this latest scandal show us about the nature of foreign aid as such, and about really the nature of our foreign policy, how we should evaluate our foreign policy. And I think it's pretty clear a lot of these programs that have been brought to light are pretty ridiculous, if not malicious. And I think that's true in spite of the fact that in various cases, the media has claimed to have debunked charges of specific ridiculous aspects that the Trump administration has reported. So every time I've looked into one of the alleged debunkings, they're usually debunkings of trivialities. They're not debunkings of the underlying policy that really does seem ridiculous, if not malicious. So, for example, it was reported that the way that the Trump administration initially reported one of the findings was that $2 million was being spent on sex changes in Guatemala. And it turns out there's no evidence that this was actually happening, but that the $2 million was being spent on an organization, on an NGO that was working on such things as gender affirming care on behalf of LGBTQ organizations in Guatemala. So not exactly sex change operations, but nonetheless, the kind of policy that some people might have reasonable objections to their taxpayer money being spent on. And whatever your view is of the merits of transgender care, you might still raise very sensible questions about why are U.S. taxpayer dollars being spent on such a thing. Or the $70,000 for a DEI musical in Ireland. So it was debunked that it came from USAID. No, actually, it was spent by the State Department, and it wasn't for a musical. It was for a music festival. These, again, seem like trivialities. The big question is, why is any U.S. tax money, why is any kind of U.S. foreign aid being sent to support such a cause? How does this fit into our national security objectives, which is one of, should be one of the standards for our foreign policy? Is there some kind of danger that if we don't preach DEI in Ireland, then I don't know, Irish Black Lives Matters will restart the terrorist troubles in Northern Ireland and that'll export terrorism to America? I mean, what's the rationale here? So there are real scandals coming to light here. And, you mentioned $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq. I suppose you could argue that would be there to, preach peace between Sunnis and Shiites. But is there any chance that Sesame Street will do that when billions of dollars spent in the Iraq War, hundreds of American lives couldn't do it? It's at the very least foolish, and nobody disputes findings like those, not of the Trump administration, but of the Middle East Forum report, I think a pretty respectable organization run by Daniel Pipes, that $122 million of USAID was being spent on groups aligned with foreign terrorist organizations, including millions that were sent to organizations aligned with Hamas. And so, whatever details the Trump administration may be getting wrong here, and that should certainly come as no surprise, I do think that these programs are very often ridiculous, sometimes malicious, and I think that the American reaction to these programs has been justifiable, that there's a basic kind of American rebelliousness against the idea that we should have to sacrifice for strangers. Why on earth should I be made to support causes that I care nothing about, that sometimes I might even disagree about? And when we were talking especially about cases where there may be terrorist organizations that are sworn enemies of the United States and its interests, it's not even just a problem that I'm being made to pay for it. I mean, it would be immoral to give money to them voluntarily. And so there's plenty that's objectionable here. And I think even more is objectionable than has come to light.
That's right, Ben. And that brings me to a point that I wanted to make. And I wanted to highlight Ayn Rand's view on this. So Ayn Rand had a very distinctive view on foreign policy as such, but that this includes foreign aid, right? And so discussing the details of Rand's view on foreign policy kind of exceeds the purpose of this podcast, which is to discuss these premises behind USAID and other foreign aid. But I think that it's like suffice to say that Rand thought that foreign aid is morally wrong. It's not just impractical or expensive or wasteful or any of these other arguments that most people are making against foreign aid, but it is actually morally wrong. And it is true, it's impractical, it doesn't work, it's expensive, but because fundamentally it is immoral. And I think this distinguishes her thinking from other people that are making arguments against foreign aid, including in the current administration. And one of the identifications that Rand makes about foreign aid that I found very illuminated is that foreign aid is usually enacted to serve the quote the public interest, right, or the common good, or the good of humanity, and all these other sort of characterizations. But this kind of like public interest is a non-objective standard for legislation in general, since there is no such thing as the public, and Rand identifies that there's no, like, the public as such does not exist. It's only a number of individuals whose interest will come at the expense and the rights of other people. And I think that the variety of the programs that are funded by USAID highlight this sort of this view. So Rand says that all public interest legislation, I'm reading from her essay, The Pool Peddlers, all public interest legislation and any distribution of money taken by force from some men for the unearned benefit of others comes down ultimately to the grant of an undefined, undefinable, non-objective, arbitrary power to some government officials. So it can never be the case that when you have such a subjective standard, that you can actually use this money in any way that is objective or really in the benefit of America.
It's worth saying a little more about why this is not an objective standard. You rightly pointed out that there's no such entity as the public to have an interest. There's just individuals. And when legislation or policies are passed on behalf of the public interest, what that really means is that some segment of the group of individuals who live in a nation has risen up with an interest group that is very vocal and claims to be a representative of the public. Or when we're talking about the global interests, some international group is claiming to speak on behalf of the interests of the world. Either way, of course, they don't actually speak on behalf of the entire group. They speak for themselves. But to get the cachet, kind of moral cachet, that should make someone want to sacrifice for them, they claim to represent the alleged greater good. But because, in fact, they are only a segment, and because, in fact, there is nothing morally speaking that can justify the sacrifice of one group to another, then there's not going to be any objective criterion that one can use to decide what counts as the quote-unquote public interest. And that's going to have implications for how policies that are justified on that basis end up being carried out. So one of the interesting points that she makes in this essay you just quoted from Agustina, The Pool Peddlers, which is kind of her classic critique of foreign aid and its role in an altruistic foreign policy, is that because it's based on this non-objective concept of the public interest, then even if you have the most honest, as you could imagine, government officials who are responsible for deciding how this aid gets doled out, even if they're as honest and have as much integrity as you could imagine a government official to have, there's just no way they can objectively decide who should actually get this aid. And so what that then leads to is lobbyists jockeying for attention as representatives of the public interest. And these lobbyists will appeal to whichever are the latest intellectual fads that intellectuals and scholars and activists are using in the given day to speak on behalf of the so-called public. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why it's no surprise that in the last 4 years or so, the latest fads have been along the lines of DEI, critical race theory, whatever kind of so-called quote-unquote woke egalitarian ideas have been popular on the left. These are the groups that end up benefiting because of their lobbyists speaking that language to the administration that's in power. And so, I mean, one of the things that she also talks about in that essay is that many people, when they look at these backroom deals, become suspicious. Oh, it's some kind of conspiracy to defraud the nation of its wealth. And yeah, there's stuff that happens behind closed doors, but it would be misleading to describe it as a conspiracy when the real corruption is out in the open. It's the moral and the intellectual corruption of the very standards that are being used to author our foreign policy, the standards here of the public interest. That's out in the open for everybody to cash in on. And so the fact that some personal element coming from the lobbyists has to be introduced, whining and dining or whatever, but it's the ideology that's at the end of the day the fundamental source of the corruption.
Yes, and Ben, another aspect that she brings in this essay that you mentioned, the pool peddlers. It's a 1962 essay, but it's like the principles that she deals with are really evergreen. So Rand identifies that there are two main arguments that people make in favor of foreign aid. And these arguments kind of fall into these two categories, which are often offered simultaneously. That is what Rand calls the idealistic argument, which she says, and I quote, appeals to altruism and swim out of focus in a fog of floating abstractions about our duty to support the underdeveloped nations of the entire globe, who are starving and will perish without our selfless help. So that is one of the arguments, the idealistic argument. And then there's the other argument that people make in favor of foreign aid, which Rand in this essay calls the practical argument, which, and I quote, appeals to fear and emits a different sort of fog, to the effect that our own selfish interest requires that we go bankrupt by in the favor of the underdeveloped nations, who otherwise will become a dangerous threat to us. So I think that these arguments and the reasons that are given in favor of foreign aid really remain the same today. Like, again, Rand wrote this in 1962, and like these were the type of arguments that were being made back then. I think these are the type of arguments that are being made, that are still being made in favor of foreign aid. So, for instance, for the first argument that she identifies, the idealistic argument, this argument from altruism, I want to quote an example of it. So it's this argument that we have as Americans this duty to support the poor nations who will perish without our help. And there's this article by Miriam DeLoffre, professor of international affairs at the George Washington University. She wrote in she was quoted actually in Newsweek, and she says, "Beyond the operational and technical, humanitarian assistance is about helping others. It's the impulse to deliver a meal to your friend who has cancer or donate to a food drive for victims of a hurricane. It's the belief that every life is worth saving and every human has a right to life with dignity." So I think this is a very clear example, and like this example, I think we have all heard a variation with maybe different concretes, but we have all heard that America, being the most powerful, the richest nation on earth, has this duty to help others that are not allegedly as fortunate, right? So this is one instance of what Rand called the idealistic argument. And then I want to highlight an instance of what Rand called back then the practical argument, the argument that America has such a big interest in supporting other countries to prevent them from turning on us. So the example here is Marco Rubio's whole argument that we need foreign aid to counter the influence of communist China in developing countries, right? Or the argument made by Samantha Power, who was the administrator of USAID under the Biden administration. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "Killing USAID is a win for autocrats everywhere." And I quote from the article, "USAID has become America's superpower in a world defined by threats that cross borders and amid growing strategic competition. These arguments that Rand identified back then really are the same that are being made today. But what Rand also says about these arguments is that neither of these arguments are true, and they actually cancel each other out, even though they're offered simultaneously. Because either poor countries are helpless and will perish without our help, or the help of the United States, or they are so dangerous and so strong that the US essentially needs to bribe them so they don't turn on us. So it's one or the other. And this is part of the identification that Rand makes that I think it's really helpful in understanding the debate around foreign aid and the arguments that are made in favor of it.
Yeah, Agustina, we've already talked about how Rand opposed the morality of foreign aid on the grounds that she opposed the altruistic morality that's usually offered in support of it. She, of course, thought that every individual's own happiness is his highest purpose. He doesn't live to serve other people, doesn't justify his existence through that service. So it's no surprise, therefore, she's opposed to it on those grounds. But this aspect of her analysis of noting both the moral and the practical arguments of the arguments for foreign aid, I think, is enlightening insofar as they are. You should ask the question: why do you think people feel compelled to offer this argument from alleged practical self-interest, if it's really the moral argument that's driving them? And here, I think it's especially revealing that when you look at some of the latest arguments in defense of USAID, these two arguments, it's not just that they're both made, it's often that they're made in like the same breath. And it speaks to how they understand both the concepts of morality and practicality. So a lot of it, when the practical argument is stressed, what's supposed to be so practical about it? Why is it supposed to be a source of power for America? It's often put in terms of, well, if we don't give this aid, there will be disdain for America's global reputation. Reputation for what? Reputation for being altruistic. This took concrete form in the way that Rubio, who you mentioned before, argued for this point. He says, I promise you it's going to be a lot harder to recruit someone to anti-Americanism and anti-American terrorism if the United States of America is the reason one is even alive today. He's talking about because of the aid that we give them. So the idea is something like this. We need to give aid to save people overseas because it gives us a reputation for being altruists. And that reputation is, for one reason or another, thought to be to our advantage. It's thought to give us influence over people because we're thought of as the good guys, good by the standard of altruism. And so, but then you have to think about, what does this actually mean? It means what we're really afraid of is not so much that the teeming masses overseas are going to rise up and, in Rand's day, it was established communist governments, which would then threaten us. These days, it's more along the lines of they will sign up for some kind of Islamic Sharia law and export terrorism. It's not so much that we're afraid that that they pose an actual physical threat to us, because, as you point out, and as Rand points out, these governments, these movements are actually pathetically weak. What we really fear is the loss of reputation. What we really fear is the disapproval of the authority, the intellectual and political authorities of the world who share this premise of altruism, who will chide us if we don't adhere to it. And so it's true that some people advocate foreign aid strictly on ideological grounds. They're true believers in altruism. They think we owe this duty. I think it's a dishonest belief that they have, but it's genuine in the sense that they have doubled down in their own minds on this dishonest belief, this dishonest morality of altruism. But also many of the advocates, especially the politicians, especially the pundits, the ones who are talking about concern for our global reputation as the alleged practical argument, this comes not from a kind of first order belief in altruism. It comes from fear of disapproval of the preachers of altruism. And this is the phenomenon that Ayn Rand called altruism as appeasement. We'll mention the essay she wrote called Altruism as Appeasement later. One of the things this explains, I think, is why there's that apparent contradiction between the moral argument, the idealistic argument, and the alleged practical argument. They cancel each other out because I don't think many of these advocates, the ones who are doing it on grounds of appeasement, I don't think they really fear any actual physical threat coming from the enemies who will not get the aid. What they really fear is that disapproval. And that's psychologically significant. It also explains, I think, their lack of concern for the actual effectiveness of any of these programs, because they're not so much concerned with whether or not the money that we deliver to dictatorships ends up fixing the various humanitarian problems that they're encumbered with. They're much more concerned about, have we shown that we are doing our part to the intellectual and moral authorities of the world? And so I think this is one of the major factors that pushes people to advocate for these programs when it's not just purely ideological, this fear of disapproval. And that's what many pushes them to advocate it. That kind of middle category between pure ideological advocacy and pure corruption is revealing. And indeed, there are many who will just cash in on the program for purely financially corrupt reasons. They have a desire for the unearned. And that's part of what gives the illusion that there's some kind of grand conspiracy to defraud. But again, the idea is out there in the open. It leads to this kind of fear of disapproval, which then opens the door for the simple desire for the unearned. It's not a grand conspiracy. The way she describes it in this essay is it's cockroaches that are scurrying to feast on the fruits of other people's sacrifice. And the idea that they should be doing the sacrifice that's pushing it all in the first place is out there in the open for everyone to see. The fact that there's no objective standard that you can use to decide which sacrifices are due to whom, because there's no objective standard for judging what constitutes the public interest, I think does explain some level of the financial corruption because of the fact that there's just no honest standard that anyone could possibly use to make these decisions.
And I think, Ben, that the discussion on foreign aid really, like I said earlier, like Rand had this very strong, very distinctive view on foreign policy, and as part of it, her view on foreign aid. So I think these two things are connected. And I think that foreign aid we should discuss in the context of Americans' kind of broader foreign policy or the lack of foreign policy. And I want to go back to this point that you were just making about this lack of an objective standard for these legislations on or these programs, foreign aid programs. So part of what this lack of a of an objective standard does is it ends up packaging together a bunch of activities that don't really belong together. Some of them are literally just foreign aid, and some of them are part of Americans' broader and potentially legitimate foreign policy objectives. So it ends up creating this package deal of activities, which are most of them are not in Americans' real interest, but some that you arguably they could be, or that we could at least have a debate about whether they are. But they are all conflated together under this umbrella of foreign aid. And I read an article from Emissary, which says, I think it was an article that was generally in favor of foreign aid, but I think it captured this package deal quite accurately. So I quote, "Foreign aid is a blanket term that encompasses several categories, including bilateral development aid, military assistance, humanitarian aid, strategic aid, non-military security aid, such as counter narcotics or counterterrorism, and multilateral development aid." So, for instance, I think that gender affirming care in Guatemala is definitely not the same as funding detention of ISIS terrorists in Syria, which is a funding for this program that is actually a thing that exists, was reportedly halted, at least partially. So clearly, gender affirming care for people in Guatemala, whatever you may think about gender affirming care, like bracketing that for a moment, and then funding to to detain ISIS terrorists in Syria clearly are not in the same category, but both programs are under the umbrella of foreign aid. So I think that gender affirming care for people abroad is not something that you could very straightforwardly argue, or at all really, that it is in America's interest. Whereas you can have a debate over whether, terrorists of ISIS terrorists, that is a terrorist organization, are detained in Syria. Well, you can argue, is that really gonna show up on America's shore? Like, they're far, like, you can have that debate, but clearly these two things are not the same and they're being packaged together.
Yes, and I think that this comes from the basic confusion at the center of this concept of the public interest or the common good. The actual purpose of government is to protect the individual rights of its citizens. Make that very clear, put that on the table. The way it does that is through police, courts, and the military. And that definitely includes foreign policy. I see that as under the heading of military. But when the way you think about what government is for is, well, government is for ensuring the public interest. And yes, that includes protecting individual rights through protecting against enemies, through military, but all this other stuff as well. Well, that causes you really to lose sight of what are the actual basic functions of government, what are the most important priorities. So a coherent foreign policy would clearly identify a nation's allies and the enemies that threaten the interests of its citizens, that threaten the rights of its citizens. And it would target those enemies with sanctions or with military action when necessary. And it would morally support its allies, sometimes maybe even materially support its allies. More on that in a minute. But the trouble is we have no foreign policy to speak of. It's not even that we have a bad foreign policy. It's that we have no meaningful, coherent set of principles that we use to identify who are our allies, who are our enemies. And so it should come as just no surprise that we end up wasting money on distractions that have nothing to do with any strategic objectives from a geopolitical perspective, money on transgender care, and meanwhile fail to fight the real enemies that we face and that we have. So why is even a cent of money being spent on operas or music acts in any country when that could be spent to fight ISIS? So the issue is there's just nothing principled that unites our leaders' vision of our role in the world. One sign of this that I will harp on is that as much as has been said about need to cut various wasteful and malicious USAID programs in the last month or so, even the biggest critics of USAID in the current administration don't want to do anything so far to touch many of its programs. And the one that I point to above all others is that one of the biggest recipients of USAID money, they get $1.5 billion from us, at least in 2023, is Egypt. And there have been a few minor cuts to various humanitarian programs from the current administration, but the overwhelming bulk of it, $1.2 billion in military aid to Egypt, has been completely untouched, completely unaffected. And you may wonder, why are we spending $1.2 billion for the military of Egypt, which has attacked our ally Israel several times in several wars in the last 50 years? Well, basically, this is the bribe that we have been paying to them since 1979 to not keep fighting with Israel. And so we're not giving them this aid because Israel can't defend itself. They were all ready to destroy Egypt in 1973, but Nixon made them stop on the grounds of being nicely diplomatic. So why are we still spending any amount of money at all to support the Egyptian military? Why not just let Israel defend itself, which it's capable fully of doing? Why do we need to bribe Egypt? But so if the critics of USAID are upset about any amount of money going to transgender affirming care in Guatemala, why don't they actually dare touch the money that we are sending to this authoritarian government hostile to our allies? It is because the major premise that drives our foreign policy, and it's not really a premise, it's a motivation, is the very kind of appeasement that elsewhere I have said is behind many advocates of foreign aid's advocacy of altruism. Fear of disagreement, fear of, in one way or another, being popular. We fear the world's disapproval if we were to simply unleash Israel. We fear probably there would be some chaos for a while as when we stopped giving money to Egypt. But it doesn't have to be any kind of sincere belief in altruism that leads us to adopt practices that are more or less in line with the same things that the altruists are advocating for. Because at the end of the day, appeasement is responsible for altruism. It's also responsible for just craven cowering before our enemies, which is what we're doing when we give money to the Egyptian military. So the broader problem here, of course, is just an overall incoherence in our foreign policy, especially our military policy. Again, driven by appeasement. So we spent decades, or we spent years, fighting various wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, sacrificing American wealth and American lives, meanwhile ignoring the real threats that we face in the region, primarily places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, places that continue to attack American interests in the region. Lately, we've been facing the threat of the Houthis in the Red Sea, threatening our commercial interests, our military interests in the Red Sea. And nobody is talking about that. Nobody is concerned about the actual enemies that we're failing to deal with. Instead, there's a show of a force at the southern border to stop day laborers from entering, as though that is any kind of threat. Meanwhile, the threat of the Houthis, the threat of the Iranians, goes unopposed. So, Augustine, I should pause just to comment on foreign aid as such and how I think it should fit into a proper foreign policy. I think few, if any, of the forms of foreign aid currently given out to various parties and countries around the world actually do serve U.S. interests. I can envision scenarios where there's an ally of ours, an ally against a real threat that we need to aid for the sake of defending our own nation and its citizens. I doubt that any of those are present today. So I should mention Ayn Rand herself thought, when she wrote about this in 1974, that if, I'll just quote her, Israel and Taiwan are the two countries that need and deserve U.S. help, not in the name of international altruism, but by reason of actual U.S. national interests in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Now, she's writing that in 1974, when both Israel and Taiwan were relatively weak. Arguably, they're a lot stronger now. Arguably, they don't need any kind of aid from us right now. All they need is to be able to buy our weapons, which we would profit from selling them. And they need our moral support, which we still, in one way or another, refuse to give. And I should say, personally, I don't think it's probably justifiable either to give military aid to someone like Ukraine, even though they could really use it, just because their security is not a vital security interest for the United States in the way that it is for the Europeans. So the Europeans may have good reason for giving military aid to Ukraine. And so as much as I bemoan the Trump administration's appeasement of Russia and the lack of moral support that's given to Ukraine, and we did a whole podcast on this just last week, I still can't get too upset about canceling USAID assistance to Ukraine. The real scandal here is not the fact that we are not giving money to them. The scandal is insofar as we've failed to offer the moral support, insofar as we've failed to, or insofar as we've appeased Russia. It's just another sign of the overall incoherence of our foreign policy. It may be that the appeasement of Russia isn't of the altruistic variety. It's not that we're worried about not being seen as sufficiently selfless with Vladimir Putin. Putin doesn't care about that. It's just plain old-fashioned appeasement, plain old craven absence of any principles, plain old short-sightedness, if nothing worse than that. And that, I think, is what it's at the root. That same appeasement is what's at the root of many other people's advocacy of altruistic foreign aid. And so to that extent, there is a lot in common between something like the foreign policy of the Trump administration and the foreign policy of the Biden administration. They both are motivated by fear and appeasement in one form or another. And so to that extent, I don't think that this latest policy of the Trump administration, as much as I think that, yeah, there are some of these programs that should be cut, I don't think it represents much of a major sea change at all in America's foreign policy.
Okay, so to close, I want to read a quote from this essay that we've been mentioning by Ayn Rand, The Pool Peddlers, that I think speaks to a lot of what you were just saying, Ben. And I quote, "The intellectuals do not care to look at our foreign policy too closely. They feel guilt. They sense that their own worn-out ideologies, which they dare not challenge, are the cause of the consequences which they dare not face. The more they evade, the greater their eagerness to grasp at any fashionable straw or rationalization and to uphold it with glassy-eyed aggressiveness. The threadbare cloak of altruism serves to cover it up and to sanction the evasions by a fading aura of moral righteousness. The exhausted cynicism of a bankrupt culture, of a society without values, principles, convictions, or intellectual standards, does the rest. It leaves a vacuum for anyone to take over and use." So I think that that quote is a good. We can wrap up this discussion with that quote by Rand. And like as we promised earlier, we will put in the show notes some resources that our audience may want to look at to learn more about our topic today. We will link to this essay, The Pool Peddlers by Ayn Rand, which is available at not cost on ARI's website. And there's also this essay that you were talking about, Ben, Altruism as Appeasement, which can be found in The Voice of Reason, one of Ayn Rand's books. And as usual, if you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe to wherever you listen to our podcast or on YouTube. And if you have any questions or comments about today's episode, or you have suggestions for episodes that you want to see us do, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. So with that, thank you, Ben. Thanks to our audience, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Agustina.